In the spring of 2003, Patricia Neal sat in a chair in a hotel suite in New York and told a journalist something she had been not telling journalists for 40 years. She was 77 years old. She had survived 3 strokes in 1965 that had left her, by the medical assessment of the people who treated her, unlikely to survive, and by the medical assessment of the people who treated those who survived, unlikely to recover to any meaningful degree of functional independence. She had recovered anyway. Not completely. The recovery from the kind of cerebrovascular catastrophe she had experienced in February of 1965 is never complete in the sense of returning the person to the state that preceded it. But she had recovered to the degree that she had continued her career, had won a second Academy Award nomination, had outlived the marriage that had organized her life for the preceding decade, and had arrived, at 77, at the specific condition of a woman who has been through enough that the things she has been not saying no longer seem worth the not saying. The journalist was from a publication that was doing a retrospective on her career. The piece was organized around the usual architecture of retrospective journalism: the films, the Oscar, the recovery from the strokes, the marriage to Roald Dahl, the losses. The journalist had asked the usual questions and had received, across the preceding hour, the usual answers: thoughtful, specific, calibrated in the way of a woman who had been giving interviews for 50 years and who understood the craft of the interview as its own form of performance. And then the journalist asked about Gary Cooper. Patricia Neal was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. She looked at the window. She looked back at the journalist. And then she said something that the 40 years of not saying it had made, by the time she said it, the most inevitable thing in the room. She said, "I was in love with him, completely. And what happened in that room was not what I told people at the time." The journalist leaned forward. Patricia Neal looked at the window again. And for the next 20 minutes, she said what she had been not saying for 40 years, in the specific oblique way of a woman who is saying something for the first time and who is therefore still in the process of finding the language for it, rather than reciting the language she has used before. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you the whole story. Not only the story of what she said in that hotel suite in 2003 and what the 40 years of not saying it had contained, but the full story of who Patricia Neal was and what her life had been and what the room had contained and what the room's contents had cost her across the decades between the room and the saying of it. Come with me. We are going back to the beginning, to Packard, Kentucky, in the year 1926, to a family that was Southern and that was Protestant and that was organized around the specific values that Southern Protestant families in the 1920s were organized around: the work, the faith, the particular emphasis on what a person owes the community they live in and what the community owes its members in return, which is recognition for the meeting of those obligations and the specific social consequences of the failure to meet them. Patsy Louise Neal was born on the 20th of January 1926 in Packard, Kentucky. She was the daughter of William Burdett Neal, a manager of a coal company, and Ura Mildred Petrie Neal, a woman whose intelligence and whose specific quality of determined practicality would be transmitted to her daughter in a form that the subsequent decades would make the most essential tool in the toolkit of a life that would require more tools than most lives require. The family moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, when she was young, and the move established the specific geography of her formation. Not the Kentucky of origin, but the Tennessee of childhood and adolescence. The specific quality of the Upper South's social and cultural world that produced in its women a combination of femininity and backbone that the Nashville to Knoxville corridor was particularly good at producing. She was, from early, a person of presence. Not the kind of presence that announces itself or that requires a stage to be visible. The kind that is simply there when the person is in a room, that organizes the attention of the room without the person doing anything specifically to organize it. Her teachers noticed it. The people in the productions at the Knoxville schools where she performed noticed it. Her mother noticed it with the specific attention of a woman who understood that what her daughter had was something that the world might be persuaded to compensate if it was properly directed. She went to Northwestern University to study drama. Northwestern in the mid-1940s was one of the serious places to study theater in America, and she was a serious student in the way of someone who has understood that the talent alone is not sufficient, and that the craft required to house the talent is the thing that distinguishes the performer who lasts from the performer who is visible once and then not visible again. She went to New York from Northwestern, Broadway. She appeared in Voice of the Turtle in 1946, and she appeared in The Heiress in 1947, which is the play that brought her to the attention of the people who bring people to Hollywood's attention, and that produced the Warner Brothers contract that brought her to Hollywood in 1949. She was 22 years old when she arrived in Hollywood. She had the face that the subsequent 50 years of photographs confirm was extraordinary, in the specific way that faces are extraordinary when they contain more than the surface. The quality of interior life visible in the features, the suggestion of thought and feeling behind the eyes that makes the camera feel that it is approaching something rather than simply recording it. She met Gary Cooper on the set of The Fountainhead in 1949. I want to stop here and give you the context for that meeting, because the context is the only way to understand what the meeting meant and what the years that followed it produced. Gary Cooper, in 1949, was 47 years old. He was one of the most celebrated actors in Hollywood, not simply famous in the commercial sense, but respected in the specific way of performers whose longevity and whose body of work have produced a quality of recognition that goes beyond the ordinary recognition of fame. He had been in Hollywood since the late 1920s. He had made films with Capra and Hawks and Lubitsch and the full range of the directors who defined what American cinema was in its most significant decades. He had won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Sergeant York in 1941. He was, by the consensus of the industry and the public, one of the greats. He was also married. He had been married to Veronica Balfe, known as Rocky, since 1933, 16 years at the point that Patricia Neal arrived on the set of The Fountainhead. They had a daughter, Maria. The marriage was not, by the accounts that have emerged across the decades since, entirely the uncomplicated domestic contentment that the public version of Gary Cooper's life suggested. He had had affairs before. He had a quality. The quality of men who have been told since their early 20s that they are extraordinarily attractive, and who have had 50 years of evidence confirming the telling of treating the specific opportunities that attractiveness provides as opportunities rather than as obligations to decline. Patricia Neal was 22 years old. He was 47. The gap between those numbers was the source of comment from the people who observed what developed between them. And the comment from the people who observed it was not the comment that the people observing it were able to make publicly rather than privately, because the Hollywood of 1949 was not a place where the observation that a married man was pursuing a young actress was considered appropriate material for public observation. She fell in love with him. She has said this. Across the 40 years between the relationship and the 2003 hotel suite conversation, with the specific quality of a woman who is not in denial about what she felt, and who is also, at various stages of the telling, in the specific relationship to her own past that the decades of perspective produce, able to see it more clearly than she could see it at the time, unable to see it without the emotion that remains in the things that were genuinely felt regardless of how long ago the feeling was. He pursued her. He did this with the specific combination of charm and persistence and the authority of a man who is 25 years older and who has the full weight of what that authority means in the specific context of a young woman who has just arrived in Hollywood and who has not yet developed the specific defenses that the subsequent decades would install. He was not a man who was in the habit of not getting what he wanted. And what he wanted was Patricia Neal. And he moved toward what he wanted with the ease of someone for whom the getting of what he wanted had not recently been seriously obstructed. The relationship began in the specific way that relationships begin in the context of a film production. In the small windows of private time that the production provides, in the dressing rooms and the cars and the restaurants where the people working on a film spend the hours between the scenes. It deepened in the way that relationships deepen when the two people involved are both genuinely intelligent and genuinely attracted. And when the attraction has, in addition to the physical dimension, the specific dimension of the younger person, finding in the older person a quality of knowledge and authority and worldliness that is itself a form of attraction for someone who has just arrived from Knoxville, Tennessee, and who is in the process of understanding what the world she has arrived in actually is. She was in love with him. This is the fact that the 40 years of not saying what she said in 2003 kept private. Not because the love was unknown, it was known in the specific way that things in Hollywood are known when they are known within the industry, even when they are not known publicly. But because the full dimensions of the love and what it had required of her, and what it had cost her, and what had happened in the room that the title of this video is pointing toward, all of that was private in the way that Patricia Neal kept things private, which was completely and without the kind of partial disclosure that permits the public to assemble the full picture from the pieces. The room was not a metaphor. There was a specific room. There was a specific event in that room. And the event was the thing she waited 40 years to say anything about that approached the full truth of what it had been. In 1952, Patricia Neal became pregnant. The child was Gary Cooper's. She was 25 years old. He was 50. He was still married to Rocky. The pregnancy was the specific kind of fact that the Hollywood of 1952 did not have good mechanisms for managing in the public sense, and that it had very efficient mechanisms for managing in the private sense, which were the mechanisms of the well-connected entertainment lawyer and the cooperative physician, and the specific combination of money and discretion that the people with money and connections used to manage the facts of their private lives that the public version of those lives could not accommodate. The abortion happened. It happened in the room. Not a hospital room, not a clinical setting of the kind that the subsequent decades would make the standard for the procedure, but the kind of room in which abortions in 1952 were performed for women who had the money and the connections to access the safest version of the unsafe option that was available in 1952, which was still not a safe option in the absolute sense, but was safer than the alternatives. She has never, in the 40 years between the room and the 2003 hotel suite, described the room in specific detail. She has not named the physician. She has not provided the information that would make the room a prosecutorial exhibit rather than a private memory. What she has said in the 2003 conversation and in the memoir she published in 1988 under the title As I Am is enough to confirm that the event happened and that it happened in the specific context of her relationship with Gary Cooper, and that it was, in the most private sense, one of the most consequential events of her life. She has said that she regretted it. She said this with the specific care of a woman who is 62 years old when the memoir comes out, and who is also a woman who grew up in a Southern Protestant household and who converted to Catholicism in 1955, and whose relationship to what happened in that room is a relationship that the faith she converted to has a very specific understanding of. The regret was genuine. The complexity of the regret, the specific complexity of regretting something that the circumstances of one's life in 1952 made feel like the only available option, while also understanding from the distance of 40 years that other options might have been possible, while also understanding that the life that followed the room was the life that was available precisely because the room had happened. That complexity is not something that the word regret fully captures. She has also said that she did not tell Gary Cooper what she was going to do. She told him afterward. She told him in the specific way of a young woman who has made a decision that involves another person and who has made it without consulting the other person, which is a decision of a kind that is sometimes made when the consulting feels less possible than the deciding alone. He was not, by her account, unconcerned. He was not the man who responded to the news with indifference. He responded with something more complicated than indifference and less simple than grief, in the way of a man whose relationship to the event was shaped by his own specific circumstances. The wife, the daughter, the career, the specific position of a man who has been pursuing something he wanted without full accounting for the consequences of the pursuit. The relationship continued for a period after the room, not as it had been before, because rooms like the one they had been in change the relationship between the people who have been in them together in ways that the subsequent months confirmed for both of them. The relationship ended in 1951, before the pregnancy. I have the timeline slightly inverted in the telling, and I want to correct it. The pregnancy and the room came in 1952, after the relationship had nominally ended, in the specific way that relationships that have officially ended continue in ways that the official ending does not fully stop. He went back to Rocky. The marriage to Rocky continued and was, by the accounts of the people who observed it in its later years, more functional and more genuine than the accounts of his behavior during the years of the relationship with Patricia Neal might suggest. Because marriages are not simply the sum of the affairs they contain, and people are not simply the worst things they have done in them, she went on. The going on is the part of Patricia Neal's story that the 2003 hotel suite conversation was the endpoint of, and it is the part that I want to give the attention it deserves. Because the going on is more extraordinary than the relationship and more extraordinary than the room. And it is the part of the story that the room has tended to overshadow in the accounts that have focused on the room. She made films. She appeared in The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951, the science fiction film that is, 50 years later, still one of the finest examples of the genre, and in which she gave a performance of a quality that the genre had not previously demanded, and that she provided with the same completeness she brought to everything. She appeared in A Face in the Crowd in 1957, directed by Elia Kazan, which is a film about the manipulation of the public through the media, and which required from her a quality of intelligence and moral complexity that the film's material demanded, and that she delivered with the precision of an actress who understood exactly what the role was about, and who had the technical equipment to produce what the understanding required. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1963 for HUD, directed by Martin Ritt, in which she played Alma Brown, the housekeeper of a Texas ranch who navigates the specific dynamics of a household organized around the conflict between a ruthless young man and the grandfather who represents what the young man is incapable of being. The performance is the kind that the Academy's recognition mechanisms are best calibrated to see specific, emotionally honest, technically accomplished, in ways that are visible on the screen without the visibility of the technique, obscuring the humanity that the technique is serving. The Oscar was received. The career was at its peak. She was married to Roald Dahl, the writer, who was brilliant and difficult, and who had the specific combination of qualities that brilliant, difficult people bring to the marriages they are in. The extraordinary intellectual engagement and the consistent insufficiency in the specific domestic registers that marriages require. They had 5 children together. They were building the life that the marriage and the children and the career were building together. And then, in February of 1965, the strokes came. They came in the way of catastrophic medical events, without announcement, without the period of warning that allows the person experiencing them and the people around them to prepare. She was at home in Los Angeles. She was pregnant with her 5th child. She collapsed. The strokes were massive, multiple, affecting the brain in the specific areas and to the specific degree that produced, in the immediate medical assessment, the prognosis that her doctors communicated to Roald Dahl. She might not survive, and if she survived, she might not recover meaningful function. And if she recovered meaningful function, the degree of that function was genuinely uncertain. She survived. She was in a coma for several weeks. She recovered consciousness. She began the process of rehabilitation that the recovery from massive stroke requires, which is not a single event, but a sustained, daily, grinding process that the person who has had the stroke does with the help of the people around them, and that the people around them do in ways that the observer cannot fully appreciate from outside. Roald Dahl managed the rehabilitation with the specific combination of love and relentlessness that he brought to everything. He was not a man who managed things gently, and the management of his wife's recovery was not gentle in the way of a man who is trying to protect the person he loves from the difficulty of the thing they need to do. He pushed. He pushed in ways that the subsequent accounts of the people involved in the rehabilitation have described as essential, and that Patricia Neal herself has described in the years since, with a complexity that includes gratitude and something else, something that the years of the marriage following the strokes revealed as a not entirely settled account of what the management had required of her and what the management had required of the marriage. She came back. The coming back is the story that the subsequent decades made famous. The actress who had the strokes, the recovery, the return to work. The Academy Award nomination for the subject was Roses in 1968, which was the film she made 3 years after the strokes, and which confirmed, for the people who needed confirming, that what the strokes had taken was not what people thought they had taken. The marriage to Dahl ended in 1983. He had been having an affair with one of their closest family friends, Felicity Crosland, for several years, and the affair became publicly known in the specific way that affairs become publicly known. Through the accumulation of evidence and the eventual impossibility of managing the evidence away from the people it was most directly affecting. The divorce was painful in the way that divorces of long marriages are painful, and in the additional specific way of a divorce from a man who had been central to the recovery from the strokes, and who had used the centrality of that role in the marriage in ways that the divorce revealed were not entirely what they had appeared to be. She had, across the 30 years of the marriage, maintained the privacy about the room that she had maintained since 1952. The memoir that came out in 1988, 5 years after the divorce, was the first place she said anything that approached what the room had been. And what she said was enough to confirm the outline without providing the full account that the 2003 conversation came closer to providing. The memoir is called As I Am, and the title is the title of a woman who has decided, at the age of 62, to present herself in the terms that the full account of her life requires, rather than in the terms that the managed version of the full account has been presenting for 40 years. The memoir is honest in the way of late career memoirs by people who have survived enough to understand that the management of the truth is a cost that the survival earns the right to stop paying. She wrote about Gary Cooper. She wrote about the relationship with the care of a woman who is describing something that was genuinely felt, and that was also genuinely complicated, and that produced consequences, the room, and then the subsequent decades of carrying what the room had contained, that the relationship itself could not have fully anticipated. She wrote about him without cruelty and without the sanitizing that would have required her to be dishonest about what he was and what he had done. And the result is the account of a man who was genuinely charming and genuinely attractive and genuinely limited in the specific ways that men like him are limited, and of a woman who was genuinely in love with him and who paid the specific price that the love required. She did not, in the memoir, say everything. The 2003 conversation was the closer account, and the closer account was still not the complete account, because the complete account belongs to her and is hers, and the 40 years of not saying it, followed by the partial sayings of the memoir and the 2003 conversation, were the degree of the saying that she was prepared to offer and that she had the right to offer rather than the right to withhold. Gary Cooper died of prostate cancer in May of 1961. He was 60 years old. He had been ill for the preceding months and had, in the final period of his life, spoken publicly about his faith in ways that his earlier public life had not included, in the specific register of a man who is facing the end of his life and who is organizing the resources available to him for the facing of it. Patricia Neal was 35 years old when he died. She had not been in contact with him for several years. The news of his death came to her in the way that the news of the deaths of people from important periods of our lives comes when we are no longer in those people's lives. From outside, through the public channels, arriving with the specific quality of a grief that the current circumstances of one's life do not have a clear place for. She had 3 children with Roald Dahl by 1961. She was in the middle of the career that would produce the Oscar for HUD in 1963. She was, in the external sense, living the life that the room had made possible by not making the other life possible. The carrying of what the room had contained, the specific weight of an event that a person has decided not to speak about fully, that they carry in the private space alongside the public life, is the kind of carrying that does not get lighter with time in the way that ordinary grief gets lighter. It gets more familiar. The person carrying it becomes more practiced at the carrying. But it does not get lighter, because lightness requires the putting down. And the putting down was not available to her in the 40 years between the room and the 2003 hotel suite. She put part of it down in the memoir in 1988. She put more of it down in 2003. She died on August the 8th, 2010, at the age of 84, in Edgartown, Massachusetts, and whatever remained of what she was carrying when the memoir came out and when the 2003 conversation happened, she took with her when she went. I want to sit with you now, my friend, in the specific quiet that this story requires. Because Patricia Neal is not primarily a story about Gary Cooper, though Gary Cooper is in it. She is not primarily a story about the room, though the room is the hinge on which the narrative turns. She is not primarily a story about the strokes or the recovery or the Roald Dahl marriage or the Oscar or the 40 years of not quite saying what she finally partly said in 2003. She is a story about what a woman carries when the woman has decided that what she is carrying is hers and not the world's, and what the carrying costs and what happens to the carrying when the woman reaches the age at which the cost of the not saying finally exceeds the cost of the saying. She was from Packard, Kentucky, and she had the face and the talent and the specific quality of Southern backbone that the Southern Protestant tradition installs in its women. And she went to New York and then Hollywood and fell completely in love with a man who was 25 years older and married, and who was not going to leave the marriage for her, and who did not, in the end, attend the procedure that ended the pregnancy he was responsible for, in a room that she did not describe, for 40 years. And then she had the strokes, and she recovered from the strokes, and she continued the career, and she maintained the marriage to Roald Dahl. And she lost children, and she lost the marriage, and she lost the things that the living of a long life requires you to lose. And she carried what she was carrying through all of it. And she wrote the memoir and gave the 2003 conversation and died at 84 in Massachusetts. And what she carried, in the end, was not the weight that the 1952 room had left. It was something lighter than that, and something more complex. It was the specific weight of a life fully lived by a person who made choices under pressure, and who lived with those choices, and who produced, from the living with them, the work and the recovery and the advocacy and the memoir and the 2003 conversation. She waited 40 years to confess what really happened in that room. The waiting was not cowardice. It was the specific management of a private truth by a woman who had decided, for reasons that her life provides, that the truth was hers and that the timing of its telling was also hers. She told it when she was ready. She was, as she always had been, on her own schedule. Sleep well, my friend, and the next time you see her on screen, in HUD, or The Day the Earth Stood Still, or the television work of the later decades, see the face. See what the face is carrying. Not the room, specifically, though the room is there, the whole of it. The full weight of a life that produced that quality of presence and that required from the person producing it more than most people are asked to produce and less than it appeared to cost. She made it look bearable. That was the art. That was also the truth.